millions of kids struggle with learning, processing, and social emotional difficulties. These challenges interfere with their ability to reach their full potential. Dr. Karen Wilson is here to help. Her extensive background in pediatric neuropsychology and higher education have prepared her for this unique mission. Listen as she delivers content to inform, educate, and empower parents and educators. This will enable you to identify challenges that kids face and get them on the road to achieving their full potential. This is Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus.
Hello, everyone. I hope that you are having a great day. I'm so excited about my guest today. She is Dr. Nicole Michaeli, a clinical psychologist, and she conducts comprehensive psychoeducational evaluations of children and emerging adults. And she developed her specialization in assessment through her extensive training in the public and private sector. Dr. Michaeli also happens to be a team member in my private practice. And in the work we do, we have had a number of discussions about the social and emotional factors that impact learning. We actually did a presentation about this topic at my kids' school some time ago. So of course I had to bring her on the podcast so that you could be part of the discussion. I think there will be a lot of aha moments while listening to this episode. So let's dig in. Hi, Nicole. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much, Karen, for having me on. I'm glad to be here.
I'm so thrilled that you're here.
Yay.
You know, we talk a lot about social and emotional factors that impact learning. And I know since we work together in the practice that I wanted to have you on to discuss this particular issue with our listeners. Part of the reasons because you did that great talk for one of our local schools, and you touched on anxiety, and we both talked about some of these emotional factors, but I knew that I wanted to have you on to talk about those issues. So I'm thrilled that you are here to lead that discussion.
Yeah, I'm so glad to be here.
So you and I see a number of kids who are referred to us because they're struggling in school, lagging in academic skills. And so, of course, we're going to assess for those academic skills, reading, writing, and math. But I'd love for you to discuss why it is also important to screen or assess for social emotional factors and maybe talk about what that would look like.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah. So social emotional factors, typically they occur oftentimes with learning and processing issues. And so that's why it's so important to also be able to identify those issues and how they might be exacerbating the learning or processing or attentional issues. In addition to that, social emotional issues on their own, like anxiety and depression, oftentimes they can impact learning on their own and sometimes mimic different, attentional or learning problems. So they might look like a learning problem even when they're not. And so that's why an assessment is so important in being able to sort of tease apart those things and understand, what is playing a role in students and sort of what is explaining the difficulties that students might be having.
Yeah. And I love that you mentioned mimicking because sometimes you don't know what it is that kids are struggling with. And I talk about that a lot. And, you might see a child who is running to the bathroom a number of times during the class. And you think maybe they're being disruptive, but it also could be anxiety, like you mentioned, and you've spoken about in previous talks, or it could be an avoidance of something that's really hard.
Right.
So if they're about to jump into a reading assignment or they have to read out loud, then they have to go to the bathroom or they have to go sharpen their pencil. Mm-hmm. And that behavior is a kind of a social emotional response, it sounds like, that can mimic disruptive behavior.
Right. And I think the reason it mimics that is because it can impact so many other areas of functioning that we don't normally think about, and not just mood.
I would love for you to talk about that. Like, what are some of those things? Because I think that's so important.
Yes.
Because when we think about anxiety, we think about depression, we think about those symptoms of worry and stress and sadness. Right. But you're talking about those things impacting other processes, cognitive processes.
Exactly. Yeah. And that's those are the things that I want to touch on that people don't normally think about when they think about anxiety. And so, first of all, I would say the first thing I wanted to touch on is that children who are anxious, who are really anxious, oftentimes have difficulty concentrating. And this is because their worry is taking up the valuable sort of mental resources that we need in order to think and learn. And so in this sense, there's not enough sort of brain power, so to speak, to go around or to be directed toward doing the things that students need to do and absorbing the information and learning and remembering things that they're needing to remember.
And that's really important because, again, it comes back to your point about mimicking, because if a teacher or a parent is seeing something that looks like attention issues, they might think it's an attention problem.
Exactly.
But what you're describing is that this mental energy that they're expending with worrying is actually can mimic an attention issue.
Exactly. Right. Because if you are so worried about the upcoming quiz that your teacher announced, how are you going to then, pay attention to and remember the next, 5 minutes of what that teacher is saying?
Absolutely.
Because they're so worried about that quiz.
Wonderful. And so that's attention. Any other processes that you think they're impacted?
Yeah. So anxiety can also interfere with different types of sort of brain skills, so to speak, that we use to perform different tasks. So, and it also impacts our efficiency with those tasks. And so one of these skills are working memory. And this is essentially the ability to keep information in our immediate awareness and use it right away. And so working memory is involved in lots of different things, lots of different academics tasks. But some of those include following multi-step instructions, doing math problems. Working memory is also important in reading and writing. And so working memory is something that oftentimes in kids who are anxious and struggle with anxiety, it is impacted. And so when you have impacted working memory, you see a lot of these skills sort of be impacted as a result.
Yeah, and I've seen that, and I think we've both seen that in our practice and in the kids that we see, because we can have kids who are really bright and have really strong working memory skills, but when they're anxious, they can't access those working memory pathways in the brain because their amygdala, that center part of the brain, is overly active and it prevents you from thinking.
Right. So that cognitive ability and that academic ability is there. But as you said, they're not reaching their potential because of that interference.
Right. So we've got attention being impacted, working memory, anything else?
Yeah. Another skill, one of those brain skills that is oftentimes impacted, is processing speed. And this refers to how quickly and efficiently can students perform different tasks. And so oftentimes children and adolescents who are highly anxious, they tend to freeze up. They second guess themselves. They might have difficulty making a decision when they're answering a question or doing an assignment. And so they oftentimes take longer to complete assignments, and the assignments or the tests or whatever they're doing becomes a lot more taxing on them because it's more time consuming.
Right.
And that is related to that slow processing speed.
Right. And I can see that those kids who like to check and recheck because they're, again, anxious about making mistakes, that would further slow them down. And then the end result is they don't finish the test or they don't finish the assignment.
Right.
So that is an important point as well. And I'm thinking about how that becomes a vicious circle because the anxiety is causing them to become slower. And then they're watching the clock tick and they know, oh, now I only have 15 minutes to finish this test. Now I'm more anxious, which further slows me down.
Right. And really, I would say what's important to note about that is that it's so hard for them to control the anxiety. And I would say that's what separates a typical student who may get nervous at times versus a child who is really anxious is because they know they're worrying excessively, but they can't control it. And so they know they need to finish the test. They know they have a certain amount of time, but they can't contain that anxiety. And so, as you said, it does become this negative, vicious cycle.
Yes. And I love that you've kind of separated normal worry from anxiety because sometimes parents and educators don't know what they're looking at. Is this kind of the normal, everyone feels nervous before a test or before a big assignment or before, they have to get in front of the class to do an oral presentation. And so what differentiates normal worry from anxiety that is debilitating, that might be even an anxiety disorder?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think that's an important question because everyone has some anxiety. Everyone worries a little bit. And actually, anxiety is an adaptive trait. Anxiety helps us to stay on top of our responsibilities. It drives students to, study for tests. It helps people adapt to their environment, look out for threats or dangers in their environment. What separates a typical student from someone who has clinical anxiety is really excessive anxiety that is out of proportion to what you would expect for that situation. And it's anxiety that is pretty constant and pretty frequent. And so typically when I've talked to kids about anxiety, the kids who are really anxious tend to express in some way or another that the anxiety is with them all the time. Mm-hmm. And so you get this sense that they are carrying it with them at all times, even when, like I said, the situation doesn't really warrant them to be anxious.
And it just seems that process of carrying that weight, like you described, is exhausting.
Mm-hmm. It is, yeah. And it's, it is exhausting, and you often see kids who are anxious be really fatigued, especially towards the end of the day. And part of that has to do with they also, this is a different subject, but they struggle with falling asleep at night because they are so wound up and it's hard for them to relax. And so when their sleep gets impacted, that can also create a negative cycle, a vicious cycle again, and make them more anxious and impact their mood.
And again, we see how it's all relates back to even cognitive and academic functioning, because if you're so anxious that you can't sleep, we know that sleep has a negative impact on attention, like you mentioned, has a negative impact on working memory, which is an executive function. Mm-hmm. And obviously it impacts your health, it impacts your overall well-being, it impacts your ability to consolidate memories. So you've got kids who, like you're describing, are anxious, not getting enough sleep, and then all the information that they've learned during the day is not getting consolidated in their brains because they're not getting enough sleep.
Right. So there's so much overlap between these areas: the academic, the mood, the sleep, the fatigue.
Right. It's all related. And it just speaks to the idea that you have to kind of look at all of those things to really figure out what's going on. You talked about anxiety impacting attention and working memory and processing speed. And I think we've talked about this before, that it also impacts a child's social functioning. I would love for you to talk about that as well, and what that looks like.
Sure. Yeah. Social functioning, typically we talk about depression and how that impacts social functioning. I think one of the less touched on subjects is anxiety and how that can interfere with social relationships. And there is research that indicates that anxiety is associated with difficulties with social relationships and less satisfaction in social relationships. And I think part of that is due to the fact that kids who are really nervous and wound up, they is similar to like with the academic functioning, they don't have those resources to pay as much attention and effort into their social relationships, into their peer relationships. And so those relationships can suffer as a result.
Right. And often those relationships are a buffer. Those are the things that contribute to well-being. So I can imagine a child who might be struggling in school and feeling anxious, and they don't have the strong social relationships because of this anxiety issue to rely on to make them feel better about what it is they're experiencing on a daily basis.
Mm-hmm. Right. And another thing we see is that kids who are anxious, they don't often make enough time for like more pleasurable, sociable activities. And so that I think is part of what underlies those impacted social relationships, because oftentimes you see kids who are anxious, they spend a lot of time with homework, and, because there is a lot of perfectionistic tendency that causes them to spend more time on, their responsibilities and what they need to be doing, and not enough time on the pleasurable activities, which in turn is going to impact the social relationships.
Right. And it seems like a lot of these nuances that you were describing are really hard for parents to pick up on. And you've described beautifully kind of the difference between normal worry and an anxiety that's interfering. But oftentimes parents and teachers don't know where that fine line is, and that's where evaluations are so helpful. So when you are assessing for social emotional factors, what does that look like? So if a parent was saying, I'm concerned about worry with my daughter or my son, and will that be part of the evaluation? And how will you assess for that? Can you talk about what that process looks like?
Sure. So we assess for anxiety and other social emotional issues in multiple different ways. We talk to and obtain rating forms from teachers and parents to get a sense of how significantly are those issues impacting the student or the child. And in addition to that, we're with this child or with the adolescent, we're using different ways to understand their social emotional functioning. One of which is some are more straightforward measures that ask more direct questions about their thoughts or their feelings or their behaviors. And there are other measures that we can use when we're not able to obtain information in a more straightforward way. They're projective measures that help to understand maybe underlying thoughts or emotions that the child might not directly express. And so those are more projective measures that can sometimes help us understand more unconscious thoughts or behaviors and really give a depth to the assessments and help understand that psychological functioning on a deeper level. And so when we put that together with the more, straightforward psychological measures, and when we put that together with the feedback obtained from the parents and the teachers, all of those things together can give us a nice understanding of where that child is at, and is it to the level of where their mood is really impacting them on a day-to-day basis.
Mm-hmm. And you do this a lot. And we do this as clinicians, but it's not enough to just give the rating forms to teachers. And I know that you spend a lot of time talking to teachers about every child that you evaluate. And can you talk about why that's important?
Right. Sure. Yeah. You're right. It is not enough to give rating forms because they do provide scores, but there isn't a context behind those scores unless you do talk to the teachers. And so the reason we talk to teachers and parents is because we want to understand how that child is doing in different settings and not just at home, which is what the parents can reflect on. And so oftentimes with students who are depressed or anxious or have other issues going on, that comes through in class, and teachers oftentimes are able to reflect on that and say, yeah, this student is really, I can really see, they really struggle when they have a test, and they really, get really nervous, and, they stammer, and they can really describe in detail the experiences of that child, which are often consistent with what we see as psychologists during the testing and with what parents are reporting.
Yeah. And that context is so important. It's so important to understand. I love that you described it's really a multimodal approach to evaluating for those social emotional factors. So you are speaking to parents, you're speaking to the child, you're speaking to teachers, and then you are giving everyone those standardized rating forms to determine, is what we're seeing typical for a 13-year-old girl? Or is this 13-year-old girl reporting more anxiety and more sadness than you would typically see in other 13-year-old girls, which I think is an important context, which brings us back to the context that you described.
Right. And I want to say that it sort of reminds me of pieces of a puzzle. When we're reaching out to teachers, parents, relying on our own observations, talking to the child, all of those bits of information are like puzzle pieces that when you put together gives you this picture of where they're at. And like you said, are their current struggles typical, or are they really causing them distress and impairment in their day-to-day functioning?
Yes. And I think getting that information in such a comprehensive way is so important. And I'm thinking right now of kids that I've seen where, you've done the parent interview and you ask about, are there any concerns about anxiety? And the parent might say, no, I'm not really concerned about anxiety. And you might even see the child and they report feeling okay most days. But then you give them the rating form where it's a forced choice. They have to say, I worry sometimes, often, or always.
Mm-hmm.
And I always get some kids who seem like they're not anxious, but they're endorsing when they're forced to really rate their own anxiety. Then you really see what it is they're experiencing.
Right. And I think that's because kids can really surprise you in that way, in the way that they're able to mask their anxiety, because they don't want to be judged for it. And I think that they at some point develop an awareness of displaying those anxious behaviors, and possibly at some point maybe they were teased for it or someone commented about it. And so kids have this way of masking those behaviors and internalizing them in ways that you can't necessarily be able to identify until you do ask those questions and probe.
Yeah, when you ask it explicitly.
Right.
And again, it seems like that masking of the anxiety that they're experiencing comes at a cognitive cost, which you've described earlier, with the attention being impacted, working memory, and processing speed.
Right.
So, when we do these evaluations and we're teasing apart how much of this is a learning issue, how much of this is anxiety, how much of this is depression, which came first, how do you decide where to focus treatment when there might be anxiety and difficulties with reading, for example?
Mm-hmm. Well, it's going to depend on where we see the issues being. So for many kids, what we see is anxiety with coexisting actual issues in reading, or, a coexisting attention disorder. Many of these issues are comorbid, which means they co-occur together. And so in those situations, we are really making sure to address in the treatment plan those areas. So we're making sure to address the educational component, through sometimes educational therapy or tutoring. And then in addition, we're also addressing the social emotional factors. Typically, when we're addressing social emotional factors, it's going to depend on sort of how long the issue's been persisting and other previous treatments and the age of the child. But typically the treatments that we're looking at are therapy and some sort of medication support, which has had the combination of those two has had the most support in terms of efficacy.
Mm-hmm. Can you talk a little bit about the treatment for anxiety and obviously it will depend on the child and any comorbid issues, but that's something that parents are concerned about. If my child is experiencing this anxiety, will it ever go away? What can we do? And can you talk a little bit about what kinds of treatments you recommend, with the caveat that it will differ depending on what a specific child is experiencing? But what are some of those strategies and treatments for anxiety or depression, for that matter?
Yeah. So one of the first treatments that we consider when we're thinking about anxiety and depression is cognitive behavioral therapy. And that is a specific type of psychotherapy that really the model of that approach is looking at how our thoughts are impacting our mood and our behaviors. And so it's really over the course of the therapy, challenging the child's oftentimes maladaptive or illogical thoughts that help to kind of serve or maintain that anxious mood or anxious behaviors that we're seeing. And so that's cognitive behavioral therapy is one of the types of treatment that's had the most support in treating these types of issues. I also mentioned, like I said, the medication support and how those two can have the most type of response to treatment when they're in combination together. And in addition to those treatments, we also look at what can we do in the context of the school to address anxiety. And so I think that's an important element because, the student is spending so much time at school. And so we want to, even though there may not be necessarily a cognitive or learning based problem or an attentional based problem, we still want to be able to provide supports within the academic environment, within the school environment. And so typically this will consist of different sorts of accommodations that would help alleviate the anxiety, extra time, extended breaks so that child could help regulate their mood. And then other types of sort of tweaks or modifications in their plan, again, aimed at addressing with the anxiety in mind.
Mm-hmm. And I've seen those accommodations really work well with a cognitive behavioral treatment plan that's implemented. Because again, like you're saying, these anxieties and the behaviors associated with anxiety manifest in a school setting. And so having a plan and that collaboration with teachers is so important in addressing those difficulties that a child is experiencing.
Right. And for teachers you touched on something important, Karen, and that's that for teachers to know that what is going on for that child, I think is important because as we talked about earlier, those anxious behaviors can sometimes be mislabeled as being disruptive or, other things that are inaccurate. And so when the teachers have a clear and accurate understanding, that helps the teachers to help the students. And so, in and of itself, I think it's important when they're informed.
I completely agree. And I've seen that where teachers may not understand the behavior that they're seeing. I talked about getting up and going to the bathroom a number of times or sharpening a pencil, or maybe even just being disruptive with peers, walking around the classroom. That can also be that anxious restlessness that we sometimes see with anxiety. And so giving teachers an understanding of the behaviors and what the thoughts are and the feelings are that are underlying those behaviors can be very helpful, extremely helpful and valuable in a classroom setting, particularly for that child.
Right. Absolutely.
So you've talked about anxiety quite a bit, but you also mentioned depression. And anxiety and depression, there are a lot of overlap in symptoms. And we know from the work that we do that cognitive behavioral therapy also helps kids who are struggling with depression. Mm-hmm. I'd love for you to talk about how some of the same strategies for anxiety, how might they be helpful for kids who are struggling with depression? And how can parents and educators support kids who are struggling with both?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great question. Yeah, I think we talked about cognitive behavioral therapy and how it challenges those thoughts. Kids who are depressed, they also tend to have maladaptive or unrealistic thoughts, oftentimes that serve to maintain a depressed mood and sadness. And so that treatment approach of cognitive behavioral therapy works in the same way by looking at and exploring with that child some of those thoughts that are going to be maintaining those feelings of sadness, hopelessness, low self-esteem. And so it really, and the idea is, as I said before, is that by challenging those and helping reshape those thoughts, we're able to then improve the mood and facilitate more adaptive behaviors for that child. And again, and we talked about the changes and modifications we can make in the school that I think can be really useful for depression, because depression can often manifest in very similar ways in terms of how it impacts those brain skills that we talked about, working memory, how it impacts processing speed, how it impacts attention and distractibility. And so in that sense, depression and anxiety are very similar in the way that it can sort of interfere with learning and learning processes.
Yeah. And it seems like depression would also impact the motivation for learning, where a child may just not be motivated to do assignments or to do the work that is needed to complete an assignment because of the depressed mood. and the low energy that often comes with that.
Right, right. And I think part of that is what we often see with kids who are depressed is that poor self-concept and self-worth, and which is oftentimes unmatching to what their real cognitive and academic abilities are. And so it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy where they think they're not good enough, or they think they're not as smart as their peers. And so it causes them to actually perform lower, not because they're actually, they have an impairment in their learning or their cognitive abilities, but because they're telling themselves that, and then they're adjusting their actions according to that mindset. And so that's why it's so important to address those social emotional factors, because it can really impact the way that their motivation and effort in school.
And it seems that these treatments that you've described and how teachers can support kids in the classroom setting means that the end result and kind of what you want is a reduction in those feelings of anxiety, a reduction in those symptoms of depression. And by doing that, you actually see an improvement in those cognitive skills that are needed to perform academically. So you get the mood benefit and you get the alleviation of the anxiety, but then you also get better attention, better focus, better working memory, as a result of implementing the treatments that you would recommend when you do one of those evaluations.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And I was just thinking that, we've spoken about the treatments, cognitive behavioral therapy specifically, medication treatment when it's warranted, accommodations at school. And I know that there are a lot of parents who are thinking, well, what can I do to support my child at home? What kinds of things do you recommend for parents who are saying, I want to play a role in my child's treatment plan as well? What can I do to support them?
Right. There are lots of things parents can do. One of the things we recommend is, parent education. I think it's important for parents to understand the sort of what their child is struggling with in order for them to be able to help their child. And so oftentimes we provide resources for the parents to be able to better understand what is depression or what is anxiety or even what is ADHD when, depending on what the challenge is. And sometimes we also recommend parents joining in on therapy, depending on the nature of what's contributing to the anxiety or the depression. It can be helpful for parents to either have their own therapy that's supporting the child's therapy or to have family therapy, again, to enhance with the goal of enhancing the child's own treatment. That's also been really helpful for families. Other things that we recommend are making sure that parents are staying on top of things like sleep, making sure to prioritize child sleep, because as we talked about, sleep can impact mood, it can impact learning, and so many other areas of functioning that sleep is reliant on. And then in addition to that, screen time. Looking at monitoring screen time, because we know that high levels of screen time are also related to impacted mood, anxiety, depression, and other issues. So really giving essentially the plan, the recommendations for parents are providing guidance of things that they could do at home to complement the therapy.
Wonderful. Those are really great strategies, really great ways that parents can support their kids, and also great ways that teachers can support students who are struggling with some of these social and emotional factors that impact learning, specifically anxiety and depression. This has been great. This is some great information, because I know a lot of parents and teachers see a lot of the behaviors that you've described and wonder about what it could be. And there may be an assumption or, again, like you said, a mislabeling of some of the behaviors. But this really speaks to, and what you've described are some of these underlying issues with anxiety and mood that can mimic cognitive problems or mimic an academic problem or mimic a behavioral issue, when in fact, it's really something else. And that really speaks to the idea that once you do the evaluations that you do, then you know where to target your intervention.
Right.
Because you don't want to treat a child who is, getting up and going to the bathroom a million times during the course of a class day with some kind of behavioral modification plan when the underlying issue is anxiety that needs to be treated with cognitive behavioral therapy.
Right. And in so many cases, in addition to the social emotional issues that can mimic, as you said, a learning issue, we also see the issues that are coexisting, the anxiety that is coexisting with ADHD or anxiety that's coexisting with a learning disorder. And so in those cases, also addressing the social emotional issues, addressing the anxiety can help to improve, let's say, the attention problems that a student is having. And so it can make it so that it's not as exacerbated for that child.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And you have such great information to share with families and with teachers. And I hope that people will listen and reach out to you, because I think that they have questions. Oftentimes after listening to this information, they have concerns about their own children or students in their classroom or clients that they're working with. What is the best way for people to get in touch with you if they have questions for you, if they want a consultation about a possible evaluation?
Yeah, the easiest way to reach me is email, and I'm at Dr. Nicole Michaeli at westlaneuro.com. And then they can also call our office, which is 310-876-4294. Wonderful.
Nicole, it has been absolutely a pleasure to have you on the podcast. I see you often, but having this discussion has been so great. And I love that we are sharing it with other people beyond our office walls, because I think that's when we really have an impact and we're able to help people who are seeing these struggles and are not sure what it is or what to do. So thank you so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thank you for having me. And I had so much fun doing this.
Yay. We'll have to do it again.
Yeah.
Okay. Bye.
Thanks, Karen. Bye-bye.
Okay. I may be a little bit biased, but that was some really great information, and I hope you found it helpful. We have put some resources related to anxiety and comprehensive evaluations in the show notes, so be sure to check them out. And before I leave, I want to thank the Tutor House for giving us a 5-star review. They posted, "This podcast has managed to find a sweet spot of educating listeners on learning differences while also speaking out about how to advocate for the student and get them the help services needed." They add, "I look forward to more episodes. Keep going, Karen. We need more voices to this work. Your podcast is much appreciated." I absolutely will keep going, and thank you so much for that review. If you are listening and you have a minute to leave a review, please do. I appreciate you, and thanks for listening.
Thanks for listening to Diverse Thinking, Different Learning by Child Nexus. For more resources, visit us online at childnexus.com.